it looks good right now. But yeah, so for my fellowship project, I decided to investigate GIS, geospatial systems, how to use them responsibly and ethically. This was important to me in large part because I'm originally from Costa Rica, and quite a lot of the conversations were around, or initial conversations before the fellowship started, were around, we collected all this data and they got into the wrong hands, and now they're building a resort around this hot spring or whatever it might be. So yeah, I was like, let's look into it. But yeah, so starting off, essentially the scenario that I started with, one of the things that I heard early on was that maps are more trusted than other types of data visualizations. They don't quite know why. Psychologically, they don't know why. One can imagine that some of the theories are that it's because usually when we see maps, it's for places that we don't know very well. You don't usually need a map of your own neighborhood until, once you move there, And so that was one of the theories. The other theory is that maps came to be around the same time as like scientific knowledge. So just there's this kind of connection in our brains potentially that maps are the most trustworthy thing in the world. And to top it off, quite often they come from government sources or authoritative sources. So quite often we just take them for what they are. And the additional thing was that GIS is becoming more mainstream. There's been quite a lot of new tools that are aimed at making traditional GIS more user-friendly. So my question was around, how can we use geospatial information systems responsibly and ethically for environmental justice? And the original plan, well, kind of more or less stuck to it, was that I would investigate community needs. I spoke with both geographers and GIS experts, as well as community leaders, people that work at nonprofits, CSOs, as well as activists, would surface common issues, co-create accessible guidance. And the last one that I will talk about in a bit is to create community spaces for discussion around this. And so we did get to the co-creating accessible guidance or creating accessible guidance, which you can find there. There's a link and a QR code if you're into that. But essentially that was kind of, I saw it a lot as like the first iteration of creating just an accessible space to discuss this, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And so what were some of the key findings? One was the huge field disconnect between kind of geographers and GIS specialists and just kind of the need. A lot of it was around, and I kind of had to work my way backwards. There was a devalued skill set. So GIS postings generally command a significantly lower salary than a typical data analyst, and not by a little bit, it's usually by tens of thousands of dollars. And that of course leads to frustration. The experts are just thinking, this is not something that is easy to do or necessarily should be completely, we have valued skills, our job is hard. And also they're alarmed by the amount of mistakes made by like the maps that are being put out there. Quite often I would hear, I just saw this on the news this week and it's completely wrong. It's basically this, it's basically that. And one of the things that I've seen is in the communities, they're steering people away from getting degrees in it, in large part because the training is not actually adequate. It's actually very techno-solutionist. They train people on the tool, but not on the underlying geography methods that would make them create like good maps. So that was one of the major findings. They're just like, study geography, or quite often they would tell them, study computer science, become a coder. This isn't a thing that's valued anymore. And so from the conversations with these experts, one of the things that came up was the series of common errors that are often done by accident, on purpose, or due to the GIS algorithms themselves. One of the things that they often said was it's getting to the point where people are just uploading their data, not really doing much else because the platforms also don't tell them that they need to do much else or don't give them the option. And some of the major ones, which are all outlined a little bit better in the guide, are normalization, which is essentially kind of ensuring that when you're comparing different areas, you're saying, there's 100 cases of this disease per 200 people versus 100 per 2,000 people. It makes a difference. And especially in cases where you're trying to justify that one community is much more affected than the other based on, like, let's say there's a new factory put into place, that's really important. Grouping essentially enumeration is where you'll find it in the guide. It's really around kind of how we decide to group communities is really arbitrary, and quite often, purposely, many government officials will do it in such ways that it minimizes kind of the impacts that would be seen. I know, like, one more concrete example that's not really environmental justice focused, but voting in the US, and how they kind of split up communities so that the African American vote is not as strong. So that's essentially along those lines. Some of the platforms actually allow or like let you do these different algorithms so that you can minimize that impact. But some of the easier ones do not, but I'll also go into that a bit. And then the last one was inferences. One of the things they said was quite often when you're combining GIS, which is like, information about location, and information about humans, which you'll need for environmental justice, they're not always at the same level. Quite often you have something at the regional level and then the other data set at a different level. And quite often people would just make inferences that, whatever happens at the county level also happens at the regional, or vice versa. Same as quite often I've been told that people use that to kind of infer that things are going well because the larger community is doing well, and they don't have data at the county level or at the smaller town level. And then the last one that was very surprising to me was that GIS systems don't do time well. And I was like, please unpack that, because I don't know what this means. But essentially, once I looked into it, they meant that it doesn't cover the lived experience of time and movement. Quite a lot. The good thing is that quite a lot of feminist geographers and time geographers are looking into this, but right now it's very much siloed into journal articles that are very, very advanced. Some of them I still have to read, but the major thing is that quite often when we use the GIS systems and just the GIS systems themselves, they're only set to cover, for example, where we live, and compare that to environmental hazard or what it might be. Whereas, like, you also have to take into account that we might spend 8 hours at home, but we might also go to the office for another 8 hours, and we might be exposed to things there, and etc. Like, we're constantly in movement. We're humans. We don't spend all our time in one place. And so that was one of the major things, that people are constantly using these GIS systems to kind of tell the story about humanity, but it doesn't actually show humanity very well. And so, yeah, there are some newer tools that do that, but they're very advanced. And then the last one was around the GIS platforms. Of course, I think this was definitely a learning for me. I don't know why I approached it this way, but I definitely thought that the platforms were a little bit more neutral than they actually were. I thought they were just hard to use, and that was a major thing. But yeah, when looking further into them, this quote from someone just kind of shared that GIS systems are founded within Western epistemologies and perpetuate the colonial gaze, right? And so kind of one of the things I roughly hear, but in the guide it's in a bit more detail by platform, kind of grouped it into two, right? There's the platforms that are easy to use, and those usually either default to US models or only have US models of the world. For some context, also in UK, pretty much every region should have its own model. For the most part, they do. However, even the UK version of its own model is off by 5 meters. So you can imagine if you try to apply the US version in the UK, it's going to be off by more than 5 meters, right? So quite often they use US models. They also have very little to no spatial analysis. So all the things that I mentioned in the previous slide around statistical errors or just errors in handling the data, they don't really give you options to deal with them. It's just upload the data and show it. And at that point, it's no longer a actual analysis, it's more of a population map, because you're showing where most of the people are. Then the last one is that there are no privacy enhancing tools. They might have data policies and they might have encryption, but most of them, that's where it stops. And one of the major issues around that is that web maps, which have their own issues as well, they actually have to use a data type called GeoJSON. And those are easily hackable by a savvy web developer or a typical hacker. They can go into Google Maps or any other web map that's being used and kind of pull out the information from there.
You're at time, Cathy.
That was. Oh, really? Wow.
Yes.
That was fast.
9 minutes already.
I will quickly go next one. Perfect. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just, kind of pushing the conversation for all the communities, and making sure that, we talk about what can go wrong. And I think the big one is what's next, GeoAI. Of course, AI is being added to everything. I've seen some good uses and some less great uses. Like I mentioned, time geography was a big one, and data management. Those practices really varied, from like having a database to having a USB stick that was corrupted. So really wanted to understand that a bit more. Thank you.